Welcome to the Equip Podcast, where we desire to equip you to think biblically, live faithfully, and navigate the challenges of our world with biblical truth and gospel hope.
So, Jay, we are sitting here today to answer the question, what are the Gospels that we have in our Bible, and what's their relationship to the gospel that we talk about? So, as Christians, when we say the Gospels, what is it that we're actually even talking about?
Yeah, so we're talking about the first four books that make up our New Testament when we use the word Gospels, plural. And as we think about what the Gospels are, I think it would be helpful for us to start out with somewhat of a general overview. And so this is how I think about what the Gospels are. So the Gospels are ancient biographies centered on the person of Jesus, grounded in eyewitness testimony, recording what Jesus did and taught, culminating in his death, burial, and resurrection, while all at the same time calling us to understand who he is and to follow him.
So if we use that word gospel, let's kind of break that down for just a minute. And where does that word originate from? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so the word in our New Testament for gospel is a Greek word, euangelion, which just means good news. And so it's a word found first in the Old Testament, most importantly in Isaiah 52:7. It's a text that Paul pulls from in Romans 10:15. And this is what Isaiah 52:7 says. It says, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him who brings good news, who publishes peace, who brings good news of happiness, who publishes salvation, and who says to Zion, your God reigns. And so I think what's important as we look at Isaiah, that idea of good news for Isaiah is connected to God's kingship and his rule and reign occurring on earth, this hope for longing that Israel had. And so that makes sense for us because when Matthew in particular summarizes the message of Jesus in Matthew 4:13, this is how Matthew records Jesus. He says, now Jesus began to go all over Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the good news of the kingdom. And so there's that connection again in the Gospels between this idea of kingship and the rule and reign of God being this good news. But I think what's important for us to also understand is that this word was also not a uniquely Christian word. It was used in the Roman period and also in other times. So one of the most interesting historical finds that we have is called the Priene calendar inscription. So in dates to about 9 BC, which is before the birth of Jesus, it is about the Emperor Augustus, so the first emperor of Rome. And this is what it says. It says, since Providence, which has ordered all things and is deeply interested in our life, has set most perfect order by giving us Augustus, whom she filled with virtue that he might benefit mankind, sending him as Savior, both for us and for our descendants, that he might end war and arrange all things. And then it goes on to say this, it says, since the birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good news for the world that came because of him. So what's interesting is that when the early Christians were using this word gospel, they were using a word that was not uncommon to their day, and it was a word that people would have automatically kind of had some of these connotations with. But what was important as Christians used that word was that they were claiming that the good news was not grounded in Caesar, it wasn't grounded in Rome, but it was centered around the person of Jesus. And that to claim Jesus as their Savior, as we saw in that inscription, and as their King, was to mean that Caesar was not those things for them. And so it appears that our Gospels are called Gospels because they record on pen and paper the life of Jesus that is the good news for us as believers.
So if the Gospels primarily, they are all about Jesus, how did these four books actually come about, and where did they get their information all from?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand that all four Gospels are connected to the apostles and to eyewitness testimony outside of the apostles. So when we think about at least two of them being Matthew and John, these are both followers of Jesus. When we think about Mark, however, and Luke, Mark, through church tradition and then also in the book of Acts, is associated with Peter, and Luke is associated with the ministry of Paul. And so what's so affirming to us as believers is that we have early church history that affirms those connections as well. And so we've got some documents from a guy by the name of Papias, and Papias calls Mark Peter's interpreter, and he says this. He says, Mark carefully wrote down what he remembered of the Lord's sayings and doings that he got from Peter. And then as we think about the Gospel of Luke being connected to Paul, the early church father Irenaeus says this. He says that Luke was the companion of Paul who recorded in a book the gospel preached by him. So while we've got 4 Gospels that aren't necessarily 4 people sitting down and writing down everything they wrote, we've got these 4 early books about Jesus that are connected to eyewitness testimony to people that actually heard him teach and do the miracles that he did.
Would it be possible that the gospel writers are drawing from more than just one eyewitness? Is there other places?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's something that we should expect, right? So I think Luke explicitly tells us he does that. So the Gospel of Luke in Luke chapter 1 and 2 tells us that he talked to these people that witnessed what Jesus did. But then you also begin to read the Gospels and you start, kind of wondering some things. So for instance, in Matthew, how did Matthew know that Joseph intended to divorce Mary after discovering she was pregnant? How did Luke know that Mary treasured certain things in her heart after receiving this message from the Lord? Like, how did Matthew know what happened on the Mount of Transfiguration if he wasn't a part of that inner 3 group of disciples? And so while we don't want to discount the role of the Holy Spirit in any of this, I do think we want to recognize that they probably talked to the people that had experienced these things in some sense. One of the most important studies in the past 20 years was written by a scholar by the name of Richard Bauckham. And Bauckham argues in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, that these names that you find mentioned throughout the Gospels, which pop up somewhat at random, are there to tell you the source of the information, so that early Christian readers, as they read through the Gospels, could have found these names and potentially tracked down the people who witnessed them and asked them what they saw.
So at times you have the moment of when an actual event would take place, and then there's some time before the event is written down. So how did that come to be? How did that stuff go from event happening to being written down?
So we know, at least in the beginning stages, that you have this form of oral transmission of the message and ministry of Jesus happening in the early church. That shouldn't surprise us because the first century was a heavily oral culture. Literacy rates are low by modern standards, and so people not only relied on these oral messages being passed around, but also placed a lot of trust in them. I think for us, we view something written as more trustworthy, but for them to know the message came from somebody that they knew was more reliable. But I think as the church spread and as the message of Christianity was going out, there became this need to write it down. I think that's what you read about in Papias and Irenaeus and some of these other figures, is that as the church spread, there was this need to record on paper what Jesus had done and the message that he shared. But I think we've got to be careful, though, because I think the modern reader, we hear that and we begin to question, okay, is that reliable, that oral testimony? But for first century disciples who followed a rabbi, we've got evidence that rabbis clearly expected them to memorize all of their teachings. And this wasn't just something that happened in Judaism, it was something that Greek philosophers expected of their students. And so as we think about that oral testimony is very reliable. And then we also have evidence that most likely people took notes while Jesus taught. So we've got some good evidence, but just to be reminded that there came a time in the history of the church where these things need to be written down for generations to come.
You said they wanted to write these things down in a form that people could understand.
Mm-hmm.
What was the importance of that? Why do they need to put them in a way that people would be able to understand?
So I think one of the most important studies that's happened in the last 30 years was done by a guy by the name of Richard Burridge. And he wrote this dissertation that basically compared all the Gospels to other first century biographies, whether they were written about a Caesar or a philosopher, an important figure. And what he found was there's a lot of similarities between these other ancient biographies and the style that we find in the Gospels.
So what would it mean then to call the Gospels biographies?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, it means that we need to set some expectations correctly because an ancient biography isn't quite the same as a modern one. Most of these were relatively simple in structure. They weren't necessarily chronological, but were many times arranged topically, really to communicate something about the person. And most of the time, there was a good amount of information about their death. And so it's interesting as you begin to read the Gospels, especially comparing Matthew, Mark, and Luke compared to John, you're going to see some timeline differences. But I think what we need to understand is that they were still writing good history for the time, for those standards, and at the same time, they were able to arrange the teachings of Jesus in a way that communicated what was important to them about what Jesus said and what he did.
So if we go back, means that we have 4 biographies in the life of Jesus. Is that fairly common when you look back at first century to have biographies like that of Jesus?
So one of the most fascinating things that you could compare is the Roman emperor during the ministry of Jesus was the Emperor Tiberius. So he's the adopted son of the first emperor, Caesar Augustus. And when you compare the evidence that we have of Tiberius versus Jesus, this is what's so interesting. So let's think about Jesus historically speaking, not from a Christian perspective. Jesus is a blue-collar worker, so he's a carpenter or a home builder from rural Galilee in the middle of nowhere on the margins of the Roman Empire. You compare that with Tiberius, on the other hand, who at the time is the most powerful and important person in the world. So as we think about those two figures, Tiberius for us is primarily known through 4 ancient sources. Only one of those was somebody that Tiberius actually knew. And as we think about those sources, the surviving copies that we have of them are around 700 years after the time Tiberius lived. When you think about us having 4 Gospels, 4 biographies of the life of Jesus, all 4 of these Gospels are connected with people that walked with Jesus, that knew him intimately, that saw what he did. And not only were they connected to those people, but they were written within a short time period after his death. So if we think about the Gospel of Mark, probably being written around 30 years after the life of Jesus, and the Gospel of John potentially being written around 60 years after the life of Jesus. But what's remarkable is that you've got this rural carpenter that has 4 incredible documents written about him. And the Roman emperor at the time, the most powerful, influential person, becomes a footnote to this rural carpenter from Galilee, which I think shows us the impact of what Jesus did and what he said.
So if there's Gospels or biographies, are they just neutral accounts of everything Jesus said and did?
I think one of the most helpful lines that I've heard that's always stuck with me is this line that there's no such thing as uninterpreted history. No such thing as uninterpreted history. Because any form of communication, you have to use a medium, and it has to be selective. Even if we're recording an event with our cameras, we've got to point it towards something and not something else. And so as we think about that, these authors were motivated to show us as readers who Jesus actually was. So they are motivated by theological motives to say, hey, this is actually who Jesus is and what he said and what he did. And at the same time, they had to be selective in doing that because as John tells us, if we recorded everything Jesus said and did, we would fill the books of every library. And so what the better question for us is not did they include everything, but did they interpret and represent well what actually happened?
So can you just distinguish a little bit more between selectivity and inaccuracy?
So I think an account can be selective without being untruthful. An account can be selective without being untruthful. So as we think about it, you could present an event exactly how it happened and miss its significance and meaning. And at the same time, what we want to think about as what the gospel writers are doing is that they're actually trying to highlight things that are true about Jesus and draw our attention to them. So that's why you're going to see in the Gospels say Jesus did this to fulfill what happened, or Jesus did this in connection with this prophecy in the Old Testament. So for us, the question isn't necessarily were they motivated by something, but did they interpret the events well? And we would say as believers that they did, that they're trying to draw us to who Jesus' identity is and what he did for us as Christians.
So kind of wrap all this together, everything we've just talked about, a lot of information, a lot of how these things came about, but take all these pieces together, and how does that impact how we actually read the Gospels as believers?
I think there's kind of three primary takeaways we could have. The first is that I want to encourage people to, while it's helpful to break the Gospels into smaller sections, I want to encourage people to read the Gospels from beginning to end multiple times, because these are narratives about the life of Jesus where they're going to communicate things through the narrative, not just in small sections. And a lot of that's going to build to the culmination of the story. And so I want to encourage people, as you're reading the Gospels, read them from beginning to end to see what they're trying to communicate. Second, I think it's helpful that as we understand both how these Gospels come together as a whole, the Lord has entrusted us with 4 unique Gospels, and he's done that intentionally. So we want to take them in some ways on their own and understand, hey, what's the unique tune that this Gospel is singing, and why did God entrust us with this one and not just one Gospel or 4 Gospels? He's given us 4 so that we can appreciate truly who Jesus is. And then the last thing I want to encourage people to do that we learn from these ancient biographies is that most of the time when people wrote an ancient biography, it was this call to imitate the person that this book was written after. And I think that's really what you see in the Gospels, is it's not just giving us information about Jesus. It's not just telling us that he performed a lot of good deeds. It's not just telling us that he did a lot of good stuff for people, but it's actually showing us that he is the Christ. He's the Son of God, like John says, and by believing in him, we would have life in his name. And so as we're reading the Gospels, the goal isn't just to read for information, but to be transformed by the knowledge of Jesus, that we would come to know and follow him with our whole lives.
Well, thank you, Jay. This has been super helpful, and I pray it's an encouragement to everyone who's listening and watching. And our goal of reading the Word is not just to learn a whole bunch of information and facts, but it's to know the goodness of who God is, to know Jesus, and to walk with him every day. So I hope this has equipped us for that task that's ahead of us, to walk with the Lord faithfully and fully. So God bless you, and we'll be back at some point with another episode.